But I hear God saying the fact that you even see it as a problem is a sign that the problem is coming to an end. I want to talk to somebody today who was going to make a decision that I don't even need a new year to come. I don't even need a new boo to come. All I need to do is come into a place where I realize that it is an end of an era for a version of me that can no longer exist in the next that God is calling me to. This is a job for a version of me that has been anointed. This is a job for a version of me that has been appointed. This is a job for a version of me that has been in me since I was little, but I didn't have the right environment to break it out. I didn't have the right components to break it out. I didn't have the right team. I hear God saying, you got the right team now. I hear God saying, you got the right vision now. I hear God saying, you got the wisdom, you got the stature, and by God, you got the favor. Are you going to step into it or what? Are you going to be who I've called you to be or what? The kingdom needs some kings. The kingdoms need some princesses. The kingdom needs somebody who will wear a crown. And I want to know, is it true or not? Because we got a world to change. We got a devil to chase. We got demons to put in surrender. And if it's you, I want to invite you to a moment of transformation.
God is about to get out of order to get you what you need when you need it, because it didn't look like you were going to get it, but you are chosen.
When God chooses to bless you, nothing can stop him. Today, for your gift of any amount, you'll receive audio of Out of Order, Bishop T.D. Jakes' inspiring reminder that the chosen will be blessed and you are chosen. Plus, show off how thankful you are for God's blessing with this striking blessed sticker. For your gift of $90 or more, you'll receive 100 bold prayers, a brand new guided prayer journal, including a compilation of prayers and promises to speak over key areas of your life. You'll also receive the God Will Supply My Needs prayer box with included cards, in addition to Out of Order and the blessed sticker.
If he has to go through yokes, if he has to reach over people, when God gets ready to bless you, he'll cross over them to get you the blessing.
Call or go online to get Out of Order today. Feel free to reach out to us on social media and share your story of how God is impacting your life. We look forward to seeing you next time on The Potter's Touch.
Go ye into all the world.
From the Far East to Eastern Europe, human hearts are in need of the truth.
We need Christ. We need hope.
But where the need is great, so are the challenges.
We've got a very strong and powerful God that's working for us.
Reaching very different nations with one very powerful message. On our next program,
Trilogy, the publishing arm of TBN, has helped over 600 authors get their message out to the world, having published books by Jay Sekulow and Max Lucado to hundreds of first-time authors. Our team has the experience and biblical perspective you can trust, and TBN can help you promote your book to thousands of people using our social media platforms. So if you want to explore this opportunity, please contact us at trilogy.tv. That's trilogy.tv.
Hey TBN, Ben Corson here.
Do you crave joy? Then watch Hope Generation every Thursday at 4:30 Eastern Time. Suicide is the second leading cause of death in my age group. I intend to change that. Ever since I was a teen, God put in me a generational mindset, so I would reach the nations with hope. We might have hell around us, but we have heaven inside us. Join me as we leave depression behind and take a deep dive into biblical hope.
TBN introduces an exclusive journey, 2,000 years in the making, with a trilogy of programs back to back to back. Leading off the Night of Faith, Dennis Haysbert hosts Episode 6 in a dramatic 6-part series entitled Inexplicable. Toward the end of the 18th century, Christianity reached the shores of Australia through brutal invasion, but somehow the gospel survived. Witness redemption through believers who champion justice and forgiveness. Next up, a brand new episode of the award-winning program, Drive Through History, where Dave Stotts takes us on a once-in-a-lifetime adventure to the Christian heritage that marks Australia's harbour city. The night caps off with flagship program Praise as we're transported to Australia, New Zealand, and Antarctica. Get a first-hand look at today's state of faith in Middle-earth and the land down under. Don't miss this epic night of faith, only on TBN.
While Christianity was exploding in China in the early 1900s, Australia was conducting its first national census and counting itself a Christian nation. But how did the gospel message first reach its shores? Christianity's journey to the nations of the Southern Hemisphere had surprising origins. 1780, British prisons were overflowing. The onset of the Industrial Revolution had sent thousands of unemployed farm workers to urban centers, where crime was out of control and prostitution rampant. Britain needed a solution, and the unique innovation they came up with was transportation.
In an act for punishment of rogues, vagabonds, and sturdy beggars, the Crown declared that offenders shall be banished out of this realm and shall be conveyed to such parts beyond the seas as shall be assigned by the Privy Council.
Transportation didn't just change the course of human history. It showed the way the gospel could be taken to the ends of the earth.
The late 18th century was quite a difficult time in British history. Society is industrialising, and therefore more people are moving to urban centres. Prisons overflowing, prostitution was absolutely rife, drinking, gambling. There was a lot of immoral activity going on.
While Britain still had an empire in North America, they transported people over there. But of course, Britain then fought the War of American Independence and lost the War of American Independence, and the government was kind of struggling to cope with the number of people that they were convicting of crimes. When Captain Cook discovered Australia, the lights come on. Here we've got a new opportunity. We've got somewhere else that we can send our troublemakers. When the government decided to set up the penal colony in Botany Bay, they had no idea of sending a chaplain. But it was when Wilberforce and his friends in the Clapham sect heard about this, they thought, that can't happen without a minister to preach to them.
And this was how it all started. The first fleet that set sail in 1787 was embarking on a grand experiment. Could convicted criminals become the foundation for a new outpost of the British Empire? The inclusion of a chaplain, as it turns out, is far more than an afterthought. The redemptive message of the gospel traveling to the far side of the planet would mark a pivotal moment in history.
What they've discovered about the first convicts is that one should not romanticize what they were like. They were, for the most part, petty thieves. They were totally unchurched, as far as we know, and Richard Johnson, the chaplain, ministered to them.
But the very fact that a British preacher was now on the other side of the world preaching the gospel in the Southern Hemisphere for the first time was thrilling to British people, and it started to fill their heads with ideas of what could now be achieved.
The flame of missionary zeal had been lit. The end of the 18th century saw the establishment of the interdenominational LMS, the London Missionary Society, and the CMS, the Church Missionary Society, among many others.
Church Missionary Society was the brainchild of the Clapham sect. John Venn, who's a preacher in this church in Clapham here, and William Wilberforce, who also lived in Clapham. The missionaries that went out there were just thoroughly ordinary people. They generally weren't ministers, they weren't trained, they weren't educated, they were shoemakers, joiners, carpenters, people who had trades in England who just believed that they were called, and they did it. They did it without qualifications, they did it without training, they just went and did it. And through them, Christ changed the world through his gospel.
But nobody said changing the world would be easy. Back in New South Wales, the colony that would become Australia, the chaplains faced what was called hell on earth.
It was what it was. It was a penal colony. These were convicts. These were prisoners, and this was a distant jail on the other side of the world. Drunkenness was rife, prostitution was rife, people were being daily hung on the gallows, whipped, and so on. It was a frightening and horrifying place, I suppose. Richard Johnson and Samuel Marsden and the other early chaplains were army chaplains, and their main role when they first came was to provide church for the military and for the convicts who compulsorily had to go to church.
Samuel Marsden was a chaplain for 45 years. And it was a very difficult situation, so to be able to survive that long testifies to his strengths. But his strengths were accompanied by very significant weaknesses.
When Marsden tried to deal with the Indigenous people of Australia, he couldn't understand they didn't want what he felt he had to offer. They didn't want to become like him. They certainly didn't want to live in a house or farm. In fact, they pitied the Europeans for their hard work. They didn't want to have to till the soil. And he felt that until that was developed within them, that sense of what he called civilization, they couldn't understand the gospel.
The Aborigines are the most degraded of the human race. The time is not yet arrived for them to receive the great blessing of civilization and the knowledge of Christianity.
So before Europeans arrived here, you had hundreds and hundreds of nations, of tribes, of people groups who lived in a kinship relationship with each other. They lived in a relationship to the country, and in a way that saw themselves custodians of creation.
British colonisation was devastating for Indigenous people. People refer to it as an invasion. The colonisers brought disease, there were massacres, people were forced off their lands, and this destroyed whole communities.
There is harm and hatred, but there's also an element of hope and of healing. And what often doesn't get talked about is the fact that there's an advocacy of early Christians. Up until their voice, we were not regarded as people. We were regarded as one of the lower forms of humanity.
So Lancelot Threcold was a missionary with the London Missionary Society, and he came to the colony of Sydney and discovered that there had been no humanitarian efforts and no evangelistic efforts to reach out to Aboriginal people. So he set up a mission near Lake Macquarie for the Awabakal people, and together with an Aboriginal man called Bourbon, they translated the Bible into the Awabakal language.
Threcold's main enemies were in government and in authority. He was the champion of the Aboriginal people, and he saw them dying at the hands of massacre, physical assault. They diminished through acquiring European diseases, and most awfully, they decreased through infertility in the Aboriginal women. And this was because of the rape and abduction and pedophilia by white settlers towards Aboriginal women. They were his chief enemies.
Lancelot Threacold gets to the end of his life and says that he was an unprofitable servant who accomplished nothing. His mission had died. There were so few Awabakal speakers left. In fact, there was no one who could read his Bible.
He said, when I first came, there were thousands. The thousands have reduced to hundreds. The hundreds have reduced to tens. And before long, there will be no more Awabakal people. And so he did not publish it. But I have a copy here. It was eventually published after his death. Evangelion upatuara Luca amba, the good story that Luke wrote. And the Bible Society was able, in 1988, on the 200th anniversary of the First Fleet entering Sydney Harbour, to publish Threlkeld and Biraband's Luke's Gospel and to give it to every Awabakal person who was still alive then. They're small in number, but still they are there and very proud of Threlkeld. Threlkeld is a great hero to the Awabakal people.
Remarkably, and out of great hardship, it was the gospel that provided the emerging penal colony with a pathway to take its first steps towards nationhood.
Resurrection is important because it is the thing which is chiefly responsible, I think, for the understanding of hope in our community. Here's an amazing reversal.
Colonel Lachlan Macquarie was the commander of the 73rd Regiment. And when they were appointed to be the regiment which was in control of the penal colony of New South Wales, he had to go with them. But before he got here, the general who was going to become the governor of the colony changed his mind. And in desperation, they said, well, we better make Colonel Macquarie the governor. So he came here as governor of New South Wales, and he spent that 6 months on shipboard with the help of his wife, reflecting on how a Christian man should live and act as governor. Lachlan Macquarie believed that God was a forgiving God who forgives us our sins and restores us. And so he said, how much more must I forgive these convicts and try to restore them to society? And so he emancipated them, which meant that he gave to deserving convicts freedom ahead of their time. His predecessor, Governor Bligh, emancipated 2 convicts. Governor Lachlan Macquarie emancipated 1,680. And many of them went on to make Australia as Christian people. It's interesting to me that in 1817, when Lachlan Macquarie called the meeting that formed the Bible Society, there were ex-convicts there, and some of them ended up on the Bible Society committee.
Samuel Marsden came into major conflict with Governor Macquarie, which was a great pity. Marsden is a complex character.
Australia wasn't the only frontier where Marsden played a pioneering role. His mission to the Maori of New Zealand is perhaps his redemption.
Well, Samuel Marsden doesn't have a wonderful reputation in Australia, but in New Zealand he had a very remarkable ministry and made a great impact. And he's regarded here as the father of Christianity, the apostle to New Zealand. New Zealand was a dangerous place for visitors in the early 1800s, and the Boyd incident in Whangaroa Harbour, where a ship's crew of 70 were killed and probably eaten, was a very alarming event and gave New Zealand a reputation as not a safe place to go at all. God put it into Marsden's heart to start a mission of the gospel in New Zealand. And this was regarded by New South Wales people as a very foolhardy enterprise, but he was a very determined man. And on Christmas Day in 1814, in the Bay of Islands, he preached the first Christian message ever in New Zealand, on New Zealand soil. There was no immediate response to the gospel, and it was very discouraging for the next 20 years or so with no conversions. But Marsden came back half a dozen times while continuing to work in Sydney as a chaplain, and he had the great joy, the great satisfaction of seeing God work mightily in New Zealand in his lifetime.
My great-great-great-grandfather heard the gospel from a man called Piripi Taumata Akura, and we credit him with being the first evangelist.
It wasn't happening all the time, but there was a pattern of intertribal warfare in New Zealand, which was really very confronting to the missionaries when they saw it. There was a lot of violence and horrible things going on, and they were just utterly shocked by what was going on just a few yards from their houses. This became all the more dangerous and devastating once the musket was introduced. Much more so because Ngāpuhi, the tribe at the north, got the muskets first. And so they just decimated the population of many other tribes.
Our tribal numbers were down to 2,000, and they were diminishing because of the battles. And with the coming of the muskets, that increased the numbers that were being killed. Taumata Akura was one of those who was taken captive.
The missionaries, both the Anglicans and then later the Methodists, became very active in trying to persuade Maori to put aside their weapons and to come to peace. And so they would sometimes go into the middle of battlefields where the bullets were flying around, and they were generally not successful, but sometimes they were. And the message of peace started to take root in Maori hearts.
So if you can imagine what that must have been like after always surviving, people were tired of fighting. There was just nothing that was going to help them bring that peace.
In the midst of all this carnage, many prisoners of war were taken and brought back to the Ngāpuhi's lands. God was at work. As Ngāpuhi became Christian, they started to release their slaves. And those slaves went back to their own people, taking with them portions of Scripture and the gospel and a fascination and enthusiasm for both.
Taumata Akura returned from there and began to teach the Scriptures, to teach what little he had picked up there, and became a very effective evangelist.
Taumata Akura quickly found himself in a situation where his tribe was wanting to have a war with a neighbouring tribe, and he was unable to talk them out of that.
He went on the condition that they not eat their enemies and that they not fight on a Sunday, on the Sabbath. They agreed with that, and he went. There is an account of the picture of him with a musket in one hand and a Bible on the battlefield, dodging the bullets. To our people, that speaks a lot. That means that this God that he has chosen to follow must be a very powerful God and is interested in saving his life. Therefore, we must follow that God. So that was evidence of the power of this God that Taumata Akura was talking about when he returned from north.
The amazing thing about the spread of the gospel in New Zealand is that it was not actually missionaries who spread the gospel. Marsden had come at the invitation of Ruatara, but then once Maori had actually embraced Christianity, particularly through those slaves who had been released, they went far and wide.
Isaiah 2, verse 4. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore.
That actually happened. Their weapons were laid down and they began to live a peaceful existence, to tend to their gardens, to care for their communities, and to have relationship with their kin who belong to other sub-tribes without fear of being attacked. I look at my photo of my great-great-great-grandfather and I wonder whether he tasted human flesh. I wonder how he must have felt in the transition from one society to another. What I do know is that he took that message and he taught it to our people. So I imagine that he really believed that it was an answer for our peoples.
This chapter in New Zealand's story stands as a testimony to the power of the gospel of Jesus Christ. The year 1833 also marked the culmination of the life work of William Wilberforce and the Clapham sect. Slavery was at last abolished in the British Empire. Wilberforce passed away just 3 days later, having achieved the impossible. Changing people's hearts and minds, however, would prove to be a much tougher assignment. On the front line was a man named Samuel A.J. Crowther, a former slave who would go on to become the first African bishop.
The European experience in Africa was quite limited. Most people held a view that Africa was this dark, impenetrable continent, and the people could not understand things in the same ways that Europeans could. Samuel Crowther appends all of that with his remarkable life. He's captured as a slave boy at the age of 12 years, and he's in a ship en route to the New World as a slave. But he is rescued by the British Navy, and he's taken to Sierra Leone, and Henry Venn of the Church Missionary Society sees the deep promise in this young man, immediately sets to help him to become trained and sent back to start missions throughout the West African district. Africans are very innately spiritual, and Crowther saw it. He translated Christ in terms of the concepts that people could understand.
It was incomprehensible to a lot of people how a black person could be a leader in the church, because the church they'd always known was white, and it just didn't compute. But there were also evangelical Christians who said, if the gospel is going to come out from Europe to the rest of the world, then we can't just rely on British missionaries. We need African missionaries as well.
Henry Venn was a man way ahead of his time, quite remarkable, because he had this vision of a church in Africa that was self-propagating, self-supporting, self-funding, and a church that would have its own leaders, and which was quite removed from the people of his time that did not believe that Africans could lead themselves.
Well, Samuel Crowther found that once his great supporter Venn was dead, he had lost support in the British establishment, and they shut the doors against him.
A new generation of missionaries take over CMS, and they fail to understand the impact that Crowther had had, and they essentially upend it by cutting resources and breaking down the relationships he had built with CMS. So his work is essentially destroyed, and he resigns in protest and dies 3 weeks later. People say he died a heartbroken man.
Crowther's story was a tragedy, but it wasn't over. The work of God in Africa would have another chapter. Half a world away in the Pacific, a different story was unfolding with far-reaching implications for the successive missions.
John Williams had made a commitment to Christ in 1814 when he was just a late teenager, and that led to an offering to go in missionary service to the London Missionary Society. He was married to Mary Chwana. 3 weeks later, they were on the ship heading for Tahiti as a young couple. Settling into a new culture, a new lifestyle, was a huge challenge personally and physically for a young married couple. The different foods, the different diseases and things are endemic in the area. But in fact, it was only 2 years that they'd been there before he had to take his wife back to Sydney to recuperate. It was a huge blow to Williams. As he travelled from Raiatea and the Tahitian group to Sydney, he took with him Papa Iha, the local Christian, and when they got to Rarotonga, Papa Iha said, well, if nobody else will go, I didn't come expecting to stay, but I'm prepared to swim ashore and I'll stay and I'll start sharing the gospel as long as you promise to send someone to help me as soon as you can. So that's what happened. Williams left Papa Iha on Rarotonga. He wasn't able to get back for another 2 years.
I am the great-great-great-grandson of King Tinomana Inua Rurutini, the first king on the island of Rarotonga to accept the Christian gospel in 1823. It was introduced to him by a Tahitian missionary called Papa Iha.
Rarotonga had been characterised by intertribal warfare between these 7 clan groups. As Papa Iha came ashore, he certainly was facing a very dangerous situation.
Now, when he arrived, he demanded that he talks to the king. He knew that protocol. He recognized the authority of the king. And then King Tinomana asked him, okay, this God that you wanted me to worship, where does he live? And Papa Iha said through his message, he lives in the heavens above. When he said that, the whole tribe all looked up. Now, because of that, to remember that event, that history, Tinomana changed the name of this people from Puaikura to Arorangi. Arorangi. Aro means look, Rangi means sky. That's the name of this village today, in remembrance of the conversion of Tinomana and his people.
Williams finally gets back to find out what's going on, and Papa Iha can tell him that the whole of this island is now converted to Christianity. The foundations were laid, and the people themselves, following their leaders, made their commitments to transfer from a trust in the spirit powers to a living relationship with God through Christ. Seeing the whole of Rarotonga turning to Christ opened for Williams a whole new understanding of the best way to go out mission at this point. He's discovered the secret, if you like, of partnership between the European and the Pacific Islander missionary, with the Pacific Islander missionaries themselves spearheading the new outreach. This pattern of partnership may seem fairly obvious from our perspective, but at the time it was something radically new. He talks about every Christian being a seed bearer, carrying the seed of new life and scattering it as widely as possible to make this offer of God's new life available to others. In 1823, the gospel has come to Rarotonga. In 1832, the first Rarotongan goes as a missionary to Samoa. In 1838, he gathers together a new group of recruits who are willing to go further west toward that largest island of Papua New Guinea, which comes to the island of Eromanga, an island which has not been touched by any other missionaries previously. And he goes ashore only to be attacked and killed by the local people. He gives his life. Williams's death at Eromanga was a traumatic experience for the missionary constituency in the Pacific, first of all. Churches right across the Pacific still to today speak of John Williams as the one to whom they owe so much in terms of their coming to faith and coming to a new way of life. There's now a whole new uprising of missionary concern. If he's been put to death, if he's died, we must give our lives to follow in his train. Not only in the Pacific, though, with Pacific Island missionaries offering literally by their hundreds to actually follow in his train. In Britain, a whole new generation of missionaries hear the story, are challenged to offer. And so you get missionaries coming to the Pacific and indeed around the world. This had grasped Williams's heart, and he's challenged Busicott to actually establish a college, and so the Theological College at Takamoa in Rarotonga is established.
This is Takamoa Theological College where we are sitting now. The first missionary that was sent, I believe, was in 1842, was sent to Samoa. And from there was throughout the Pacific, right down to Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, the New Hebrides, Solomons, all throughout the Pacific. Missionaries were sent from this college. That means that they would leave on the ship and they would be available. They would make the sacrifice. Some never returned. Some were martyred. And they would go as families. They would go as young couples, willingly knowing that they would not return, some of them. And others not fully knowing where they were going, but just following the cause of the gospel. And I don't think their sacrifice went to waste. I mean, all of the students are descendants of these early missionaries. And by them being here, training and developing to be ministers for the gospel, is carrying on the legacy.
But the result of this, of course, is that we jump forward to today. The Pacific is one of the most thoroughly Christian influenced areas in the world. Could Williams have ever envisaged what we now find in the Pacific today? It's hard to know. Williams was very conscious of the fact that God's providence was at work behind all the events. So he saw behind the unexpected storm, behind the sickness of his wife, behind the tragedy of so many lives, he knew that there was a greater plan being worked out. And while we find it hard and we like to argue about how could a good God of love possibly allow such suffering, he specializes in making what happened at Calvary, where he gave his son to suffer in death for the sake of others. He specializes in somehow turning those events into life-giving, life-changing opportunities for others. And that's really the heart of our gospel, isn't it?
We now come to the middle of the 19th century, when Christianity among the Maori tribes of New Zealand would face the destructive impact of imperial colonization.
Many of the missionaries were seen as genuinely coming in peace and in love for Māori. With the building of relationships between the missionaries and Māori, they were loved and they were welcomed into their communities. They trusted them. There was this mutual relationships were formed.
Because of the threat of colonisation, missionaries and the British government worked together to arrange a treaty between Māori as a sovereign people and the British Crown. But the downside, as it were, is that it would legitimise wholesale colonisation. And that's where the problem came. Because with these settlers coming in, by and large, the treaty was not honoured by the settler governments. There were wars from 1859, land wars, between the government and some of the Māori tribes. There were subsequent confiscations, which were very unjust.
There's a famous event that took place there where two prophets, Māori prophets, they decided to have a silent protest and be peaceful. And the military went in and attacked them as they were peacefully protesting about the treaty not being honoured. And they looked up and saw the missionaries on the side of the soldiers.
The casualty was Māori enthusiasm for Christianity, and in some cases they gave it away. New Zealand's a very secular place now, with just over half of New Zealanders actually claiming no religion. In New Zealand, the injustices of the colonial period have left a long shadow which has affected Māori Christianity.
Jesus is the answer. It is the person of Jesus, Christ, who comes in cloaked in a korowai, a Māori robe, a traditional robe, who speaks Māori, who understands, who hears the Māori heart. We need a move of the Holy Spirit to come through once again. That's my desire for our people.
Africa's colonial legacy is no less bloodstained. But from the tapestry of stories, a different image emerges.
It's difficult to explain why did Africa become Christian, even with the history of colonialization and the difficult, terrible, human rights, abuse that took place in the colonial government. Why did we become Christian? I have to say that in the midst of it all, there were always the bright lights of missionaries who, even as they made their mistakes, did it with a pure heart and with a desire to spread the gospel and to tell the truth of Jesus Christ. Even in the midst of the horrible colonial things that were happening, that the gospel remained untarnished and somehow spread to us. And once it was in the hands of the African church, I think it began to spread like wildfire.
So why did that happen is a really good question. I think there's a number of reasons. Following in the legacy of Samuel Crowther and others, a lot of British and American evangelical Protestant missionaries saw Bible translation as their supreme task. It took decades to translate the New Testament, let alone the whole Bible. What that spoke to these, to the tribes and the indigenous peoples that were having the Bible translated into their language was a deep reverence, respect, admiration for their culture and for their language. God speaks in my language, which was the ultimate take.
At first it seems sad that his work was not continued as he himself had dreamt it, but it becomes a catalytic seed to show that it was possible to raise African leaders and then to show that Christian scriptures could be rendered into all of the languages of Africans. So in a sense, his legacy continues.
It was the converts, the African converts, that actually are responsible for the vast majority of the expansion of Christianity in Africa. And it was those people then that began to spread the gospel in a way that took on really wildfire. From 8.5 million in 1910 to 516 million in 2010, approximately. Philip Jenkins, who's a well-known scholar of global Christianity, says that represents the largest or the most rapid expansion in the history of the world. I think if people look back now, if those people who were involved in the missionary movement in 1900 and we see what was happening today, they would be absolutely shocked, amazed, thrilled. It would be a mind-blowing experience for them, I think.
A brand new indigenous church of Africa is nothing short of extraordinary. Equally striking is the not yet widely recognized Australian Aboriginal Church, born from the ashes of what was in effect cultural genocide. A powerful testimony to the grace of God.
I think it's a pity that there is such a long period of time, more than a century, that elapses before the Europeans begin to think that there is anything credible or worthwhile about Aboriginal people and their culture.
My father was the first ordained Aboriginal Baptist minister in Australia. My parents stepped into the legacy of people who had been, we would call them missionaries now, but they weren't actually given the status of missionary, pastor, or a church leader.
Well, they didn't work in a white fella way, they worked in a black fella way. And that meant that they were itinerant for a start, that they walked huge distances. In the case of Barnabas Roberts, he limped throughout the north of the Northern Territory down into the centre. I knew Barnabas personally. And from him I learnt about how those missions had become places of refuge for Aboriginal people who were being shot. He once said, if the missionaries hadn't come, my people would be all gone. But the death of his father, the shooting of his father, which he witnessed, had a profound effect on him. He felt that the death of his people might be worthwhile after all, if somehow, as a result of that, other people heard the gospel. Now, it's a very hard thing for me to say as a white man whose ancestors may have been involved, but it's what Barnabas Roberts said. Barnabas dedicated his life to bringing the gospel to other Aboriginal people so that the death of his father and the rest of his tribe would not be in vain, that there would be an outcome. And his very last words, "At last I am free. I'm free of the blood of my people. I'm free of the blood of my people." Who would dare to ask that of him?
The hope for Aboriginal Christians here in Australia is one of leading their own communities, but of leading the country through what I would call a renaissance of identity, where people feel like we're part of this land now, we're part of this country now. We belong here together. And that's an ongoing and ever-evolving relationship with the Holy Spirit, an ever-evolving relationship with following Christ.
Australia has been prophetically called the Great Southland of the Holy Spirit. And despite almost impossible odds, it would, by the turn of the century, become just that.
Australia, at the time of Federation in 1901, was a very Christianised country, I think. And it was the sort of country which was open to movements of the Spirit. You saw them especially in the goldfields and in the new farming communities. Whole communities influenced for the gospel.
Just one such account is recorded by a preacher in 1860.
To a congregation which packed the building I preached from, quench not the spirit. What a time we had. The whole assembly was mightily moved. The power was overwhelming. Many fell to the floor in agony, and there was a loud cry for mercy. The police came rushing in to see what was the matter, but there was nothing for them to do.
So Australia has not been as anti-church and anti-Christian as the secularists would have us believe. The stereotypes are wrong. The Light of the World painting by Holman Hunt was brought to Australia in 1906. It was on a world tour. Sydney in 1906, the population was about 500,000. And of those 500,000, 300,000 went to see that picture. Some people knelt before it, other people wept. It was quite something. I think it means is that Jesus, who is prophesied in the Old Testament to be the desire of the nations, he's been the desire of the Australian nation as much as he's been of any other nation.
Discovering this firsthand was Billy Graham, who in 1959 held crusades across Australia.
In Billy's autobiography, he mentions that he'd been advised that it wouldn't be big because Australians were amiable pagans and sport-loving and not particularly interested in religion. So they planned on having a reasonably contained event. It took them all by surprise.
Today we are seeing the largest crowd ever to assemble in this historic stadium. The capacity of the stadium is 103,000 persons, but multiplied thousands have been allowed on the field, the first time that a crowd has ever been allowed on this field. Other thousands are jammed for miles in every direction outside of the stadium and are still coming to what is going to be, we believe, the largest meeting that Billy Graham has ever addressed.
What a tremendous thing this is today. There are enough Christians here today, if we were fully yielded to Jesus Christ, could change the whole history of the world. On the day of Pentecost, there were only 120 praying. That's all. And yet within one generation, they turned the world upside down. Today, there is enough spiritual power here, if we were all filled with the Holy Spirit, that could change the whole world picture at this moment if we meant business. And if revival should continue, it might be a flame that could leap the oceans and sweep into other countries and make a tremendous contribution toward peace in our time. I believe that the only hope of the world at this moment is that men and women will come in repentance of sin and faith in Jesus Christ. So today is not the end. This is not the climax. This is the beginning. This is the beginning of a spiritual awakening, the beginning of a mighty evangelistic effort on the part of the churches. And you're to have a part in it.
A quarter of the entire Australian population heard Billy Graham in 1959, and 1.24% of the population accepted his invitation to come to Christ. Billy said, "I have never seen spiritual hunger like this." In 1973, that the Pentecostals in Australia, who were very small up until that time, decided that the charismatic movement was a good idea and that they should embrace that. And I think through the 70s and 80s, it continued to grow exponentially. The clearest example of the growth of the Pentecostal movement in Australia is the Hillsong Church. This was established in 1983 by Brian and Bobby Houston. The growth and influence of this church have been remarkable.
Our beginnings were very small, to be honest with you. We started right on the fringe of the city of Sydney in Australia. In those days, it was right on the edge of the rural area. And we started in a tiny little school hall, and our start was very inglorious. It was very first Sunday, we were excited. We thought we had revival because 70 people turned up, 7-0. After that, we started to see people give their lives to Christ, and it's been a miracle story. But our beginnings very, very humble, and it's amazing. You look at something like Hillsong now, and obviously it's global and it's broad and it's big, and it can feel like all of that happened in such a short time, but it really has been 35 years really of just steady building, 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards. You know, you keep doing what you're doing long enough, and it's amazing what God can do.
The growth of Christianity in Australia, as surprising as it is, has been dwarfed by the church in Africa. Pew Research Center counts Africa with over 500 million believers, among the most committed Christians in the world. Now, why is this happening? And what does it mean for us today? Perhaps the answers can be found within the African church itself. Just one example out of hundreds scattered across the continent is the Nairobi Chapel in Kenya, a congregation of 30,000 with a host of global church plants to its credit.
Well, the church began in 1952. Kenya was still under the British government as a colony.
Independence meant that many people from the colonial governments and the colonial structure left. Well, it meant the Nairobi Chapel, which was largely made up of white expats, was a shell of its former self and was in danger of dying as a church.
They prayed together for 6 months, and they felt the Lord say to them, do not close, and go to an indigenous African church led by Africans and give this church over to them. And so they agreed together. They came to the Nairobi Baptist Church, and I was a young man leading a Bible study. They had just finished my theological education. By and large, they humbled themselves, and they were more than willing to allow for change to take place so that the church could be revitalized.
I was in Nairobi Baptist when Oscar gave his initial sermon where they were introducing him, and the rest is history.
So we're very aggressive in our evangelism to the communities around us. I had a real desire to share the gospel, and somewhere along the line, I picked up a passion for church planting. And our goal in the first 10 years was to plant 7 churches. We didn't even make it to 7, but that passion just grew and grew and grew and grew. And today, it probably is central to defining who we are as a church, the passion for church planting.
This is really part of almost the remarkable vision that Samuel Crowther had, that he set out to raise African leaders, and once given opportunities, they just stand out and they just get into spaces that nobody would have expected them. Someone like Steve Miner, who has ended up as a bishop of Nelson in New Zealand, started out as an intern in Nairobi Chapel, and in the 1990s.
I was absolutely moved to realize that there were so many places around the world that didn't actually have the gospel. I had an experience that in Kenya, because everywhere you went, there were people on the streets worshiping Jesus. Some countries in the world, 0.6% Christians. And I thought, that's not fair. We in Africa, we in Kenya have been given so much, and yet there are others who don't have that.
Steve is an amazing person. Amazing because he is absolutely dog-rabid, passionate about the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so it wasn't a surprise when he told us that he would like to go and serve overseas, somewhere else. It was at a time when we were asking the question of, will Africa ever send out missionaries, particularly to the global West? And Steve came along and he said, I'm here, I will go.
One of the things that I noticed having come here was the loneliness that a lot of people feel, the struggle with hope. Mental health has become an epidemic in New Zealand society. And so my sense was that I think there's something that those whose faith has been born in the context of suffering and need can offer to those in societies where they're struggling with hope.
It's amazing to see what God is doing, because it's almost as though Steve was, for us, the beginning of what has been called reverse missions. We always thought that a missionary is white and comes from a European nation and etc. But it's become clear over the years that the church in those centers that sent us the gospel is struggling.
everybody now is recognizing that something is shifting in the Western world. Christians are being pushed into the margins in Western society. I think what's happening right now, what the Spirit is saying is that we all need one another.
We need one another because ultimately the mature church is characterized not by independence, but by interdependence. Africa's gift is tons and tons and tons of young people. I believe that the world missionaries are in Africa. We need one another. Where I am weak, you are strong, and together we are strong. Together, we can do it.
Now, the Christian faith is global. The only religion in the world with a major presence on every continent. Today, there are over 2.2 billion Christians in the world. This number has tripled in the past century. And Christianity continues to expand in some unlikely places. In Asia, the Christian population of 350 million is projected to grow to 460 million by 2025. The global religious wild card is China, and estimating the numbers is difficult. Researchers believe that there are now 97 million followers of Jesus in China. 40% of the world's Catholic population live in Latin America alone. And the number of Protestants in Latin America has grown from 50,000 in 1900 to over 65 million today. The signs of spiritual vitality in Latin America are unprecedented, with enormous crowds gathering to celebrate Jesus at events in Colombia, Argentina, Guatemala, Mexico, and Brazil. Our journey into the inexplicable has uncovered the ways followers of Jesus have taken his message of love and forgiveness to the ends of the earth.
Missions is like a relay. It's, many, many miles over many, many days, and there's a baton that is being passed on from one people to the next, one generation to the next. And that race began in Palestine with the people of the Middle East. It moved over to, Europe, and from there to England and Greater Europe, moved from there across the seas, and one baton went to the West, Western Hemisphere in America, the New World, and the other went east towards China and such. I think it's something that God has allowed to be the reality of the spread of the gospel, and the baton is in the Africans' hands. I think our time has come in that sense, and we must run and run well.
I believe that the task that we've been given by God to see the world come to know Jesus is too big for any of us, any part of the body of Christ, to do it on their own. What is exciting is that we don't have to do it on our own. We don't have to feel like we're on the back foot, whether you're somewhere in New Zealand or Australia or any other part of the Western world. God has given his church the gifts needed to enable the world to come and know Jesus. It's time for us to acknowledge those gifts, to receive those gifts, to celebrate those gifts. For all of us need to be in the arena. All of us need to play our part. All of us need to participate to see the world come to know and follow Jesus.